Welcome to Chapter 6.6 on hormones, homeostasis, and reproduction. These slides go along with the 6.6 notes packet that I provided to you. If you don't have one, they're either on Schoology or you can find them on the table behind my desk. Homeostasis. Okay, homeo meaning same, stasis meaning status. Okay, homeostasis is the body's ability to maintain a stable internal environment. And this happens on a cellular level. Okay, so cells need to be able to export waste, increase nutrient intake, all kinds of things, regulate what goes in and out to maintain homeostasis. And then, of course, we have different systems and tissues in our body to help the same thing. So examples of homeostasis in the human body: maintaining the proper blood pH, okay, which many of you may know is slightly basic, around 7.3. Okay, maintaining proper blood carbon dioxide concentration, blood glucose concentration, which we're going to talk a lot more about in this chapter, body temperature, and osmotic balance, which we've talked about before. Homeostasis works with a series of what we call negative feedback loops. And negative feedback loops sound really difficult, but they're not, okay? We know that in a range of values, okay, that we're supposed to be maybe, let's say, somewhere in the middle. So for body temperature, for example, your body temperature should remain about 37 degrees Celsius. If you get too hot, some things are going to happen to return your temperature back to that middle value. If you get too cold, some other things are going to happen to return back to that value. Okay, so in negative feedback loops, the processes that occur bring a value back towards a set point. That's a little bit different than a positive feedback loop where things might feed off of each other. And the more you have of something else, okay, the more that causes something to increase farther. But in negative feedback loops, okay, we're always bringing the value back to a set point. So for example, with body temperature, if your body temperature falls below the normal 37 degrees, the hypothalamus, which we've talked about a lot with some other body processes, is going to send a message along a motor neuron to your muscle. The muscle is going to start to shiver, which is a series of fast muscle contractions. Muscle contractions require ATP. ATP is generated through the process of cellular respiration. Okay, and just as a review, cellular respiration is glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen, yields carbon dioxide, water, and two types of energy, ATP and heat energy, because it's not 100% efficient. So that generation of heat causes our body temperature to return back to normal. So we've decreased the body temperature. Maybe you're standing out in the cold. All these things start to happen and we return back to the set point. That's a negative feedback loop. Homeostasis is a complicated process that requires a couple of different body systems. Okay, one of them is the nervous system. Okay, and the other one is what we call the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system produces hormones that flow into the bloodstream. That's a little bit different than when we talked about the exocrine system. Okay, exocrine glands secrete fluids via ducts. Okay, so like the gallbladder. Gallbladder is an example there. Okay, so they're secreting something to a specific location via a duct. Endocrine glands work a little bit differently. They secrete a hormone that goes throughout the entire bloodstream. Okay, it does, however, only affect certain target tissues. So how does this work? Well, some kind of sensory neuron somewhere in your body sends a message to your brain. Okay, that brain interprets, okay, well, maybe something's not going right here. It will then send another message to an endocrine gland, which is going to release a hormone throughout your whole body to try to bring whatever that value is back to homeostatic levels. So let's go ahead and label some of the endocrine glands in the body. In the center of your brain here, we have a small gland called the pineal gland. Then we have the hypothalamus. Underneath of the hypothalamus is the anterior and posterior lobes of the pituitary. We'll talk more about those in a little bit. We have in the throat the thyroid gland. And within the thyroid gland, we have the parathyroid. Okay, a little bit further down, we have the thymus. Now, these aren't a gland, but just to give you an idea of where we are, here are your kidneys. And sitting on top of your kidneys are your adrenal glands. And these adrenal glands secrete adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. We talked about that with the control of the heartbeat. This lumpy bumpy organ here is, of course, your pancreas. Your pancreas is super cool. It's both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. We know that it's an exocrine gland because it secretes digestive juices into the small intestine via a duct, but it also secretes hormones into the bloodstream. So it's both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. Okay, now this strange unisex figure here is showing both male and female endocrine glands. Here, if you are a female, you're going to have the ovaries, and if you're a male, the testes. Okay, so how do hormones work? Well, first we need to know that they're a lipid-based molecule. So if you don't have enough fat in your diet, you're going to have a hard time synthesizing some of these hormones. We also need to know that they are secreted into the bloodstream, okay? So what does that mean? Well, any endocrine gland, like let's say your thyroid right here, is going to secrete hormones into your bloodstream. So that means that these hormones are going everywhere throughout your entire body. So how come they only cause certain effects? Well, that's because these hormones are specifically shaped to fit into special receptors on whatever their target cell is. So, for example, the pancreas, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, secretes a hormone that only affects your liver cells. So that hormone is actually circulating all throughout your body. But if those cells don't have these special receptors, they pay no attention to that hormone. Okay? It's only the target cells with the special receptors that are affected by that hormone in the bloodstream. One of the hormones that you need to know is this hormone thyroxine, and thyroxine is secreted by the thyroid gland. So we love it when things are easy to remember. And we need to know that thyroxine controls metabolic rate. So if your thyroid produces too much thyroxine, you have what we call hyper, which means above, hyperthyroidism. People with hypothyroidism have a very high metabolism. They have a hard time maintaining body weight. They have a hard time regulating their temperature. Much more common, however, is when your thyroid produces too little thyroxine. So that's known as hypothyroidism. These people have, a hard time maintaining a healthy body weight. They gain weight with no reason. They have a hard time controlling their metabolism. And just a fun fact here, this is what we call a goiter. Now, this thyroxine hormone has to have iodine, okay, in order to be synthesized. If you don't have enough iodine in your diet, your thyroid gland will swell and swell and swell to compensate. These have become a lot less common because we've put iodine into certain foods to help prevent these. Next up is the hormone called leptin. Leptin is actually produced and secreted by fat tissue, which is also known as adipose tissue, for those of you taking other courses where you're learning about these things. And leptin's job is to decrease your appetite, and that makes sense to me. The more fat you have, the less you should be eating, the less you need to eat. So leptin is produced by fat tissue, and it's supposed to tell your brain, hey, I have enough calories stored in my fat tissue. You don't need to eat anymore. So it decreases your appetite. Some of the problems with leptin, we think that probably in chronically and genetically predisposed people that are obese, their brain can actually become desensitized to the leptin. So their adipose tissue might be producing the leptin, but their brain isn't interpreting that signal correctly anymore, and it's not working to decrease the appetite. So here what we're seeing over here is actually a mouse where we have removed the gene for secreting leptin, and you can see that this mouse is obese, okay, has no leptin to tell the brain that the appetite has been decreased. Okay, next up is melatonin. Melatonin is something that some of you may have taken before. It's a pretty common pill found in the body, in the vitamin aisle. And melatonin in the body is secreted by the pineal gland, which is found deep in the center of your brain. Melatonin's job is to regulate the day and night cycle. You are supposed to be sleeping at night and awake during the day. So when the brain senses that it's dark outside, it's going to produce melatonin, okay, which causes you to sleep so that you're sleeping at night and awake during the day. If you travel through several time zones, your brain is thinking, okay, well, I probably have a few hours before it's usually dark. But if you're in a new time zone, it might actually be nighttime before your brain is ready for it. So your brain might not be creating the melatonin that would normally put you to sleep. So if you're experiencing this phenomenon known as jet lag, you can actually take these melatonin pills to help regulate your day-night cycle. Okay, so again, what we're looking at here is the pancreas. Remember, the pancreas has two functions. It can function as an exocrine gland, secreting things like pancreatic amylase, lipase, trypsin, and a buffer into the small intestine via a duct. But it's also an endocrine gland. Other cells, okay, secrete hormones into the bloodstream. There are two hormones produced by the endocrine cells of the pancreas. We have insulin, which is secreted by beta cells. Now, beta, you might sometimes see written like this. You might also see it written in its abbreviation, like a big B with a fancy tail. You need to know both. And then we have glucagon. Glucagon is secreted by alpha cells, which you may see written like this. So within the pancreas, okay, we have our exocrine glands, which are going to secrete digestive juices via duct. And then we have our endocrine cells, okay? We have alpha cells that secrete glucagon and beta cells that secrete insulin. Blood glucose levels have to remain at homeostatic levels. Let's take a look at why. If these black dots represent glucose and this circle represents a cell, this cell is what's in an isotonic solution, meaning no water is going to move into or out of the cell. Okay, now this is really important in case you're talking about like a red blood cell floating in blood plasma. We need those solutes to be the same concentration on the inside and the outside so that no water rushes in or out of the cell. If we have a hypertonic solution in our blood plasma, like there is too much blood glucose in the plasma, then what's going to happen to some of this extra water in the red blood cell is it's going to exit the cell. That's known as osmosis, to help give these guys more room to spread out. It's going to cause our red blood cells to shrivel. On the other hand, if our blood glucose level, the plasma glucose level is what we call hypotonic, then the concentration of glucose in the plasma is much lower than on the inside of the cell. In that case, water from the plasma is going to enter the cell, and it's going to cause this cell to expand and expand and expand until it bursts. So we need a way of keeping our glucose that's in our plasma isotonic to the glucose levels in our blood cells. See if you can answer the questions on this slide on your own. Okay, so now would be a good time to pause this, think about it, see if you can answer them, and then play it again when you're ready. All right, after meals, carbohydrates are broken down into glucose molecules and are absorbed into the bloodstream. They are absorbed in the small intestine. The features that help with this are the villus, or the villi, plural. Enzymes involved in carbohydrate breakdown, okay, are things like amylase. That blood flowing from the small intestine is going to go to the liver, and then that liver regulates the glucose level in that blood. All right, so cells that are in tissues that suddenly increase the rate of respiration, like they're under exercise or something, okay, they're going to require more glucose than normal. Where are they getting this glucose? Well, they're going to get that glucose from hydrolyzing or cutting up the glycogen that's in the liver. And they're also going to be absorbing glucose from the bloodstream. This is going to cause our blood glucose levels to dip. So here's a period of exercise. I'm using that glucose that's already in the blood. Here's a period where we're eating and digesting. The two hormones that are released by the pancreas that help regulate glucose levels are insulin and glucagon. Let's talk about insulin first. Insulin has two functions. Okay, first of all, it's going to cause the liver cells to absorb the glucose. So liver cells are absorbing the glucose. If they're absorbing it, then that's going to remove it from the blood. They're then going to take all the individual glucose molecules that were in the bloodstream, and they are going to connect them together to make glycogen. So that's what's going on down here. That glycogen is going to be stored in those hepatocytes, in those liver cells. The second thing that it does is really cool. It causes glucose channels in your body cells to open. So how does that work? Well, your body cells have lots of different membrane proteins. Remember, membrane proteins have different functions. Okay, they can function as channels for facilitated diffusion, passive transport. They can be receptors. Here we see a process where they're acting as both. When insulin is released by the pancreas, it binds to an insulin receptor on the body cell. That then tells the glucose protein channel to open. Once the glucose protein channel is open, glucose from the bloodstream can go into the cell. But again, that protein channel doesn't open until insulin binds with the receptor. Okay, glucagon, on the other hand, okay, is going to do the exact opposite of insulin. Again, it's acting on the liver cells, okay, but whereas insulin turns glucose into glycogen, glucagon tells the liver to take some of that glycogen and cut it up into glucose molecules and release it into the bloodstream. So glucagon tells the liver to take some of that glycogen, cut it up into individual glucose molecules, and release it into the bloodstream. I always say when your glucose is gone, you secrete glucagon. So this is going to happen when your blood glucose levels are low. Okay, so you should have received some cards with some steps on them. If you didn't get any, they're on the table over behind my desk. You're going to arrange those cards in a pathway that shows how the liver and the hormones of the pancreas regulate blood sugar. Again, the goal is to always end up with homeostasis in the middle. Okay, and we know that because of the way that negative feedback loops, we're going to have one action when blood glucose levels are low and one action when blood glucose levels are high. So homeostasis gets disrupted, causes them to become low, a bunch of things happen to return the levels back to homeostasis. Same thing, when you eat or something, it's going to disrupt it, make your blood glucose levels high. Some things are going to happen to return those blood glucose levels back to a homeostatic level. Press pause now to be able to give yourself time to do that, and then I'll show you the answers on the next slide. Okay, so now is a good time to kind of check how I put this negative feedback loop system together with what you have, and then you may want to pause the video. Okay, your body's inability to regulate the blood glucose levels is a disease known as diabetes. And there are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 diabetes is known as juvenile diabetes. It's something that you're born with. It's usually diagnosed before age 8. Type 1 diabetes occurs when the beta cells of the pancreas don't produce enough insulin. The only way to control this is to give yourself insulin shots. This is relatively rare. About only 10% of all the diabetes cases are type 1. The reason this is rare is because this is what we call an autoimmune disease. And if we break this word down, it means your immune system is attacking itself. Your body's own immune cells attack its own beta cells in the pancreas. It destroys the beta cells, and then your pancreas can't produce any insulin. So this is just an inability to produce insulin. Type 2 diabetes is what we call adult onset diabetes. In this case, your body is producing insulin, but the body cell receptors aren't responding properly. So remember, these body cell receptors are supposed to bind to insulin and cause the glucose channels to open. In type 2 diabetes, these receptors just aren't responding to that insulin, and we're not able to absorb the glucose from the bloodstream. So in this case, you need to find another way of controlling how much glucose is in the bloodstream. And you're going to do that by restricting the diet, low carbohydrate diet, and exercise, because the more cellular respiration we need, the more glucose we're burning off. Type 2 diabetes represents about 90% of all diabetes cases. It's associated with genetic factors, obesity, lack of exercise, age, ethnicity, lots of other correlating factors. Regardless of the type of diabetes, if left untreated, it can cause a lot of serious problems. Diabetes is the #1 cause of blindness and of kidney failure. So remember, the kidneys are responsible for filtering out and having the body reabsorb some of that glucose through the nephrons of the kidneys. If you're asking your kidneys to do that on a constant basis, okay, that could cause your kidneys to fail. Same thing, nerve damage, poor wound healing, which we're seeing here, often results in amputations and an increased risk of heart disease. Let's move on to the next part of chapter 6.6, which is all about human reproduction. So we need to remember a couple things about human reproduction. Okay, we're going to hear a lot about hormones, and we're going to hear a lot about anatomical structures. So the first hormone that we're going to take a look at is the male sex hormone called testosterone. And what's interesting about testosterone is that it does different things at different points in a male's lifetime. So during embryonic development, testosterone is going to cause the formation of male genitalia. During puberty, we're going to start to see the development of secondary sex characteristics. We'll get to that more in a little bit. And then in adulthood, it's testosterone that's responsible for sperm production and sex drive. So the same hormone can have different effects during different points in a man's life. All right, next we're going to be drawing, labeling, and annotating the male reproductive system. I'll tell you, it's a good idea to maybe make this drawing about 1/3 of the space that I've given you so that you have room for annotations in a little bit. So I'm going to draw the male reproductive system from the side view. It's a little bit easier from the side. And I'm going to start with the testes. Well, maybe I should choose a smaller pen here. Okay, so let's start with the testes. Okay, I'm just going to draw one because I'm drawing it from a side view. And kind of on top of the testes is a little tissue called the epididymis. So sperm are actually produced in the testes, they mature in the epididymis, and then they travel through a tube called the vas deferens. Now, I'm just going to draw the beginning of this tube. I'm not going to draw the whole thing. And yes, that shape is important. Okay, the vas deferens is the shape because it's got to go around this big structure, and this is the urinary bladder. Okay, as the vas deferens curves around the urinary bladder, it's going to receive some secretions from the seminal vesicle. So some fluid, some carbohydrates, okay? And then the next secretion is going to come from the prostate gland. Okay, the prostate gland is going to secrete the majority of the fluids and the majority of the carbohydrates that the sperm are going to need for energy as they're swimming through the vaginal canal. All right, now, because the male anatomy shares some ductwork, okay, urine coming out of the urinary bladder is going to join with this tube, and all urine and ejaculatory materials pass through the same tube. Not at the same time, though. There are things to control when urine is passing through that tube and when semen is passing through that tube. It doesn't happen at the same time. And of course, that tube is known as the urethra. All right, so let's draw in the next section, okay? There's the urethra. What I'm drawing now is the erectile tissue of the penis, and that becomes engorged with blood, which causes an erection. So that's the internal anatomy. If I continue on with the external anatomy, I know this isn't the best drawing, but there's the penis. So again, this tube is the urethra. It's surrounded by erectile tissue, and then here would be the skin surrounding it. Okay, here would be like the abdomen. Okay, and then continuing on with the external anatomy, we had the scrotum. And then here would be like the butt cheek. All right. Now, for men, when they have a prostate exam, okay, you don't have to draw this next part, but I'll show you. Okay, the anus of the male would be right here. So when they're having a prostate exam, okay, the doctor will actually insert his or her fingers up through here so that it can feel the prostate exam. They're pretty close together there. All right, so let's get rid of this. Well, okay, I can't get rid of that anus. Sorry, guys. You're just going to have to deal with that being there. Okay, let's go back and do some labeling. So if we label these in the order of the journey of the sperm, they are, of course, produced in the testis. IS would be singular, ES would be plural. Again, make sure you're leaving room for annotations. So sperm are produced in the testis, okay? They mature in the epididymis. They travel through this tube called the vas deferens. Men who have had a vasectomy have had this tube cut or tied. Fluid enters, okay, the sperm through the seminal fluid, followed by the prostate. Again, sorry, this anus is in the way. And then it's going to go through this tube called the urethra. Okay, now just because it shares some ductwork, we're going to go ahead and label these even though they're not part of the reproductive system. And that would be the urinary bladder. And again, okay, that also sends urine out through the urethra. On the next slide are some annotations in regards to function. Okay, so now's a good time to go ahead and stop the video, to pause the video, to add your annotations. Okay, now let's move on to the female reproductive system. I'm going to draw the female reproductive system from the front view. Okay, it's simpler in anatomy, more difficult to learn in function. So female anatomy, I usually start with some kind of a triangle shape here and a tube. Okay, now the female reproductive system is unique in that it is a muscle. Almost the whole thing is made of muscle. It's pretty cool. Okay, so we have a muscle here, and this forms the muscular wall of the vagina. It narrows here to become part of the cervix. And then it also comprises the wall of the uterus. Okay. Now, on the inside of the uterus is a highly vascular lining Vascular meaning has lots of blood vessels. Okay, and that highly vascular lining is called the endometrium. The endometrium is where the embryo would implant, and that's shed each month during menstruation. Okay, coming off the uterus are 2 ovaries. And that's about it for the female reproductive system. All right, so let's go through and label. So we have the vagina. Again, leave room for annotations. This narrowing is called the cervix. Then we have the muscular wall of the uterus. Eggs and other cool things are produced in the ovary. Each ovary connects to the uterus through the fallopian tube. You also want to know the other name for the fallopian tube, which is the oviduct. Ova meaning egg, and you know what a duct is. And of course, this highly vascular lining is called the endo, which means inside, metrium. Mitra, Greek for mother. So inside the mother, we're talking about the lining of the womb. Now's a good time to go ahead and pause the video and annotate your drawing with the functions of each of those. Okay, so there's nothing for you to take notes on here, but just to make sure that we're clear and so that we can review. The sex chromosomes of a female are XX. She has 2 copies of the X sex chromosome. And for a male, he has an X and a Y. And of course, we know it's the father that determines the gender because the mother is always passing along X's to her offspring, okay? And it's the male that can either pass along an X to create a girl or a Y to create a boy. So what is it about these different sex chromosome pairs that makes one of them a woman and the other one a man? Well, of course, sexual determination is determined at the moment of conception. Either that sperm that's fertilizing the egg is either a male or a female, but we actually don't see sexual development until around week 8. So from weeks 0 to 8, male and female embryos are going to look identical. At around 8 weeks, if there are 2 X chromosomes, the alleles on those X chromosomes interact to produce estrogen and progesterone, and those trigger the development of female genitalia. If there is a Y chromosome present, testosterone is going to be produced, and as we talked about earlier, testosterone causes male reproductive organs to form during embryonic development. All right, time to talk about everybody's favorite topic, which is puberty. In males, puberty is dominated by the production of testosterone. And we said earlier that testosterone during puberty causes the development of secondary sex characteristics. So what are those secondary sex characteristics for males? Well, that includes the growth of facial hair, underarm hair, chest hair, pubic hair, deepening of the voice that is caused by the actual growth of the larynx, the voice box, increased muscle mass, and enlargement of the penis. Okay, females during puberty. Okay, puberty is going to happen a little bit earlier on in females, and that's largely governed by estrogen and progesterone. It's going to have some very different effects. Okay, these hormones cause the enlargement of breasts, growth of pubic and underarm hair, and widening of the hips. Why would the hips need to widen during puberty? Well, okay, puberty is the transition into adulthood, which is readying the body for reproduction. So the widening of the hips is a natural process to get ready for childbirth. Okay, now it's time to talk about everybody's favorite topic, the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle is one of those transitions into adulthood that happens during puberty. It's involved with readying our bodies for reproduction. And the menstrual cycle is about 28 days long. Just a couple fun facts here. Some evolutionary biologists believe that human menstrual cycles are 28 days long, which is ironically the same length as the lunar cycle. So how might that have happened? Well, they're hypothesizing that maybe early man was using this full moon period to go out and, while it was light outside at night, steal some of the prey of nocturnal predators. And while they were all hopped up on adrenaline from doing that, they were also encountering women and trying to impregnate them. So it was advantageous for women to also be ovulating during this time, which would put them on a same 28-day cycle. A lot of historical references to the menstrual cycle are made in several cultures, like believing that they had special powers, separating them from men, all kinds of things. If you're interested in a really interesting book on this topic, I recommend a book called The Red Tent, by Anita Damiant. It's a retelling of the book of Genesis from a woman's point of view, and the menstrual cycle plays a big part in this. Not as gross as it sounds, I promise. Okay, so what is menstruation? Well, remember, the uterus has a highly vascular lining called the endometrium. The endometrium is where a fertilized egg would implant itself. If there's no pregnancy, a woman has to shed this lining. This endometrium, takes a lot of energy for your body to produce. A lot of calories and stuff go into making that lining, which is one of the reasons why women feel hungry right before their period, maybe more so than they would at other parts of their cycle. So if there's no pregnancy, there's no need to use all those calories to keep the lining of that uterus. So that's going to be shed each month. In a moment, we're going to be diagramming where your hormones come from. And that's going to involve parts of the brain that we haven't really studied yet. So I just wanted to give you a cue here as to where we were. Here's your brain. This person's brain, this is the front. So like your eyes and your nose and your mouth would be over here. And then the back of your head would be over here. Oh gosh, that's bad. Here's that person wearing a baseball cap. Anyways, deep within the brain is a structure called the hypothalamus, down in here, and that hypothalamus is connected to the anterior, which means front, and posterior, which means behind, lobes of the pituitary. Those are not testicles, those are the lobes of the pituitary. Each of those lobes is going to do very different things, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. I have no intention of writing out the full names of the hormones that we're going to be talking about with the menstrual cycle every single time. So I'm going to be abbreviating them. It's important to know what those abbreviations stand for. GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's exactly what it sounds like. It has something to do with the gonads. It causes other things to release their hormones. And then there's something called the luteinizing hormone, LH. You'll find out what that does in a little bit. And then follicle stimulating hormone. It stimulates the development of the follicle. So where do all these hormones come from and what do they do? Well, I'm going to start with structures and with hormones. I'm going to enclose the structures in squares and the hormones in circles. All of your hormone production starts in the area of your brain known as the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to secrete the GnRH, this gonadotropin releasing hormone. When the gonadotropin releasing hormone finds the anterior pituitary, it causes it to do some other things. So we're going to play a little game of like a hormonal relay. The hypothalamus releases GnRH, which causes the anterior pituitary to release two hormones. One is called LH, luteinizing hormone, and the other one is called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Both of these hormones act on the ovaries. Now, they do different things in different parts of the ovary, but we'll get to that later. These ovaries are then going to be triggered to produce two hormones of their own. One of them is estrogen. You may also be seeing the British spelling, which puts an an O out here. It's the same thing. Okay, so the ovaries secrete estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and both estrogen and progesterone affect the endometrium. Okay, so again, we've got a little hormonal relay going on. The hypothalamus in the brain secretes GnRH. GnRH causes the anterior pituitary to produce LH and FSH. LH and FSH cause the ovaries to secrete estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone both cause the endometrium to become thicker. More on that in a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about FSH and LH. We'll go into more detail on their exact effects in a little bit, but for now, it's worth saying that the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, works on the follicle, which is the structure surrounding the oocyte or immature egg. Now, we know that the hypothalamus secretes the GnRH, which tells the anterior pituitary to produce FSH and LH, and they act on the ovary to secrete estrogen. They do other things too, but estrogen secretion is one of them. Estrogen is going to cause two effects. One of them is it's going to cause the endometrium, that lining in the uterus, to become thicker. And it's also going to tell the anterior pituitary to release even more FSH. So here's an example of a positive feedback loop. Okay, the estrogen on its own causes the anterior pituitary to produce more FSH, which produces more estrogen, which tells the anterior pituitary to produce more FSH, which tells the follicle to produce even more estrogen. So by itself, estrogen is in a positive feedback loop with the anterior pituitary. We're going to use this diagram to trace the cycle of events that happens during the menstrual cycle within the ovary. So here we have the ovary and the fallopian tube, the uterus, and the endometrium. It's important to note that this happens in a cycle. Not all of these events are going on at once. They're happening at different times. Okay, in the next few slides, you're going to see events written under each one of these things. Okay, try to put them where I wrote them just to leave yourself some room. We're going to begin with the immature egg called the oocyte. Yes, that's the correct spelling. Okay, cyte meaning cell, oo referring to egg, so this is the immature egg cell. It's important to know that women are born with all of the oocytes that they are ever going to have. Okay, and then each month, one of these oocytes will finish its meiotic divisions and become a mature egg. But this is why maternal age is such a risk factor for things like Down syndrome, because these are present at the time that a woman hits puberty, and every month that a new one comes into the cycle, they're just getting older and older and older, and sometimes those meiotic divisions don't occur correctly. Okay, when the hypothalamus secretes the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, it triggers the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH and LH. These hormones, particularly FSH, cause the development of what we call the Graafian follicle, which is this yellow here ring of cells around the oocyte. Okay, so the more FSH that is produced, the more mature this follicle or Graafian follicle becomes. The Graafian follicle is what actually produces the estrogen. Okay, so we just talked about this a couple minutes ago. Somewhere over here, the anterior pituitary, okay, is secreting LH and FSH. Okay, this LH and FSH causes the follicle to develop. The follicle actually secretes the estrogen, and that estrogen causes the anterior pituitary to produce even more of these hormones, which causes it to develop even more, which produces even more estrogen, and it just keeps going in a positive feedback loop. When those FSH and LH levels get really high, it's going to trigger ovulation, and that's when the follicle releases the egg into the fallopian tube. Notice that when the follicle releases the egg into the fallopian tube, the follicle stays behind in the ovary. It's then not known as the Graafian follicle anymore. It becomes a structure called the corpus luteum. Corpus, body, luteum, empty. Okay, it's literally an empty body. Now, what's interesting about this corpus luteum is that it also produces its own hormone. Okay, and that hormone is called progesterone. Progesterone is going to further thicken the lining of the endometrium. Okay, so we had estrogen from the follicle thickening the endometrium. Now we have progesterone from the corpus luteum thickening the endometrium. So it's going to get thicker and thicker and thicker. All right, and what's really interesting about this process is that we know estrogen on its own causes an increase in the amount of LH and FSH. Okay, but estrogen and progesterone together cause a decrease in LH and FSH. Okay, so here when they're together, they start a negative feedback loop. And that's so that another follicle doesn't develop. We already have an egg that's been ovulated and into the fallopian tubes. We don't need another follicle developing. If pregnancy occurs, then a whole series of things are going to happen to maintain endometrium and to start the development of the embryo, a whole bunch of crazy stuff. But we're going to focus on if no pregnancy occurs. That's a more common thing. So if no pregnancy occurs, this corpus luteum is going to break down. It's going to degenerate. And since the corpus luteum produces progesterone, as it breaks down, progesterone levels are going to drop. Since progesterone maintains and thickens the endometrium, if I have less progesterone, it's going to cause that endometrium to be shed. Okay? Now, in my ovaries, I have no follicle to produce estrogen. I have no corpus luteum to produce progesterone. So the drop in both of those is going to trigger the hypothalamus to release GnRH, and a whole new cycle is going to begin. So now's a good time to kind of pause the video just to take a look and make sure that you understand the functions of the different hormones and maybe perhaps a better picture of what's happening with this development of the follicle, of ovulation, and the development of the corpus luteum. All right, so let's talk about birth control pills. Okay, how do birth control pills work? Well, first of all, it's worth noting that there are lots of different types of birth control pills and methods, and they all work a little bit differently. But these traditional birth control pills are basically just an overdose, well, maybe not overdose, a high dose of estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone together are in a negative feedback loop with GnRH, so they're going to inhibit the production of GnRH so that no follicles develop. You're basically hormonally tricking your body into thinking that it's pregnant, okay, by maintaining those hormone levels. So if a body's pregnant, then there's no need to release any more follicles. That's why it's very important that you take the pill every day and that you take it at the same time every day, because if these hormone levels drop, it can kickstart that cycle over again and you can ovulate. At the very end of the birth control pack are 7 pills. These pills usually contain no hormones, and since progesterone and estrogen a little bit, but mainly progesterone, is responsible for maintaining that endometrium, if I don't have any progesterone for a week, it's going to cause the endometrium to be shed, and that's when menstruation would occur. Okay, in this graph, we're going to be tracking the various hormones and the events in the ovary and in the uterus over time, which you see down here at the bottom. So since the menstrual cycle is split up into 28 days, we're going to see day 0, day 14, day 28. All right, in the first one, I'm going to track the gonadotropins, FSH and LH. I'm going to put them together. In this second box, I'm going to track the events of the ovary. Sorry, not sure what that happened. Okay. In this next line, I'm going to be tracking estrogen, progesterone, and the endometrium. Okay, now the first thing in this list that we're going to track to be secreted is the FSH and the LH. So I'm going to find kind of like, I don't want day 14, like maybe day 7. Okay, I'm going to draw up to first. So they start out at really low levels and they start to rise. As they start to rise, okay, we get the development of the follicle around the oocyte. Okay, so that follicle around the oocyte, okay, develops and starts to produce estrogen. Okay, so as that follicle develops, estrogen is also going to be secreted. Estrogen causes the lining of the endometrium to thicken. Now, none of these things affect progesterone, so that's going to remain at low levels. So all of these things are in a positive feedback loop with one another. FSH causes the follicle to develop. The follicle secretes estrogen. Estrogen causes the endometrium to thicken. Estrogen on its own, because we don't have any progesterone here, increases the amount of FSH and LH even further. Okay, so the more estrogen I have, the more FSH and LH I'm going to produce. So around day 14, we see a spike, okay, in FSH and LH. And that means that my follicle has fully developed here. And at day 14, we have so much of the FSH and LH that we have ovulation. So it's maybe worth noting that day 14 is ovulation. Okay, so again, this follicle is the thing that's secreting the estrogen. So at day 14, estrogen is also going to peak. And the lining of the endometrium increases a little bit even further. Progesterone still at low levels. Okay, now once ovulation has occurred, we no longer have a follicle. We have the empty body called the corpus luteum. So if I no longer have a follicle, my estrogen levels are going to start to decrease. As this follicle develops, not the follicle, as this corpus luteum develops even farther, okay, it's going to start to produce progesterone. So here it's producing a little bit, here it's producing a whole lot. So this progesterone is going to go up and up and up. Okay, so estrogen and progesterone together inhibit FSH and LH. So it's going to cause their levels to drop. And of course, it's progesterone, which is secreted by the corpus luteum, progesterone, what causes the further thickening of the endometrium. So on your graph, you should be showing the endometrium thickness at its peak at the same time as progesterone. So FSH and LH and estrogen peak together at the time of ovulation. Progesterone and the endometrium peak a little bit later. Okay, so let's finish this out. If no pregnancy occurs, this corpus luteum starts to break down. It breaks apart. When it breaks apart, our progesterone levels are going to drop, okay, which is going to cause the endometrium to be shed. Endometrium can't be maintained without progesterone. Our estrogen was already on its way down. Our FSH and LH were already on its way down. And so here we are at the end of the cycle and ready to begin again. So day 28 is the same thing as day 0, and this cycle would start all over again. So we've looked at the menstrual cycle as a cycle on a drawing. We labeled the parts of that ovarian cycle. We looked at it visually with a graph. Now's a good time to take a moment to pause this video to write it down as a list, okay? Outline meaning write the events, list the steps that happen in the menstrual cycle. So again, take about 5 minutes to do this, and then restart the video again and take a look at the mark scheme. Here's the mark scheme for outlining the events of the menstrual cycle. So we're looking at a maximum of 8. Give yourself a mark for each one of these that you got. Okay, so we already talked about what happens if the body doesn't experience a pregnancy, so if that egg isn't fertilized by a sperm. Now we're going to talk about a little bit about what happens during normal conception and implantation, so if pregnancy does occur. So again, around day 14, that egg or oocyte is released into the fallopian tube. Okay, sperm actually fertilizes the egg in the fallopian tube. Yes, they've swum all the way up the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, and through the fallopian tube. So this is where fertilization occurs. Then that zygote, that fertilized egg, is going to copy itself until it's a big ball of cells. Okay, that big ball of cells, which we now call an ovary, is going to implant itself into the endometrium. And there, a normal pregnancy would ensue. Some couples face a lot of problems with this pregnancy process. Okay, there's actually a lot of events that need to occur almost perfectly in order for pregnancy to occur. Everything from the hormones to the release of the egg to the fertilization. Okay, so it's amazing that we have so many people on the earth when it seems so difficult to get pregnant. But couples who are facing problems with infertility could have a variety of problems. In males, it could be that they have a low sperm count. Okay, that the testes aren't producing enough sperm or they're not maturing right in the epididymis. They have impotence, like a physical inability to maintain an erection. And in females, it could be that they're not ovulating normally. So perhaps they have a hormonal issue, or perhaps they don't have enough body fat, and those hormones, FSH, LH, estrogen, all of those are lipid-based molecules. So if you don't have enough body fat, okay, you're not going to be able to produce those hormones in order to ovulate normally, which is why a lot of extreme female athletes will actually stop menstruating. It could also be maybe they're not ovulating normally because they have a cyst on their ovaries. A cyst is a benign tumor that's usually filled with fluid, and that could be causing a problem with the release of the eggs into the fallopian tubes. Like they could be getting in the way there. Or it could be that they have blocked fallopian tubes. Whatever the case may be, there are things that people can do to treat infertility, all of these symptoms individually, or they could try taking fertility drugs, which are high levels of hormones causing the release of multiple eggs from the ovaries. And then the last result is usually in vitro fertilization or IVF. It's a shame I can't link another YouTube video in here, but for anybody that was in my standard level class last year, we watched a news clip of this 64-year-old German lady who is the oldest mother to quadruplets. And she became pregnant with quadruplets through in vitro fertilization. So in vitro fertilization basically works like this. We're going to take an egg from a woman, we're going to take sperm from a male, we're going to fertilize that egg outside of the body, and then we're going to put it back into the woman's uterus. So how does that work? Well, step number 1, we're going to give shots to the woman to stop the secretion of her own hormones. We don't want her going through a normal cycle. We're then going to give her a super high dose of FSH. FSH is going to cause multiple follicles to develop. That's how much FSH we're giving her. Then the eggs are harvested using a needle. So usually what they'll do is an intravaginal ultrasound. So stick an ultrasound wand up the vagina so that they can see what's going on here, and then stick a needle into the ovary to harvest those eggs. Once the eggs have been harvested, okay, then they have to harvest sperm. Okay, so we're going to take a man's ejaculate and we are going to then mix the harvested eggs and the sperm cells together. Those fertilized eggs are going to be allowed to develop into embryos in a petri dish. So we're going to allow that zygote to copy, mitosis, to become a big ball of undifferentiated cells known as an embryo. Now, at this point, we can optionally screen those embryos for diseases and other conditions. So we can see if the embryos carry a genetic disease. We could also screen for gender. I'm not saying that this is morally acceptable, but we also have the scientific capability to screen for other traits like eye color and, a widow's peak and all kinds of genetic traits. But whether or not you choose to have those embryos screened, okay, the last couple steps here is that one or more of those healthy embryos is going to be planted in the uterus, and then pregnancy occurs normally. So IVF is just a way to skip the normal ovulation, fertilization, implantation method, and to get the eggs, to get the sperm, and then to plant an embryo back in the uterus. It's kind of important to note that just because we can do things doesn't necessarily mean that we should, okay? So there's some definite ethical considerations here with in vitro fertilization. Like John Legend and Chrissy Teigen used IVF, and they specifically chose a female embryo to implant back into her uterus. So it begs the question, should we be able to choose our gender? And should we be able to choose eye color? Should I even be able to choose whether or not that embryo has a genetic disease? So I'm not saying yes or no one way or the other, just things to think about. We also need to consider, should there be age limits to things like in vitro fertilization? And if so, what age? Should we limit how many embryos we implant? So here's Octomom with 8 embryos in there. And, anytime that you have multiple births, those different embryos are having to share that space. So decreased availability of nutrients and space. Also, multiples are more likely to be born premature with a whole host of developmental problems. So it begs the question, should we limit those things? And if so, whose choice is that? So in vitro fertilization, really cool science, but definitely something that we're going to look for in the future as to some interesting ethical arguments. Okay, so on these next few slides, you're going to see some practice questions. I recommend that when a new question pops up, that you pause the video, give yourself a chance to answer it, and then you'll see me write the answer on here. So, again, now would be a good time to pause this. Which organ secretes FSH? That would be the pituitary. Okay, pause again here to let yourself answer it. Which labeled structures represent the epididymis and the prostate gland? Well, the epididymis is definitely right here. Okay, and the prostate, it's a little bit hard to tell. I don't know, we're kind of down to 3 and 4. But here's where it's important to note the order of things. As sperm is produced in the testes, matured in the epididymis, travels through the vas deferens, the first gland it encounters is the seminal vesicle. It doesn't encounter the prostate until second, so we should be looking for 1 and 4. Okay, pause here. How does fertilization differ from copulation? Fertilization always produces a zygote. Okay, copulation is just intercourse. Okay, and intercourse, of course, involves gametes. Fertilization is not a conscious event. You can't help it. And fertilization can't spread HIV. Copulation does. Okay, pause here. Give yourself a chance to answer it. Which letter indicates the cervix in the diagram below? That would be C. Okay, pause here. How is in vitro fertilization different from natural fertilization in humans? And that is C. In vitro fertilization happens outside of the body. A is wrong. Okay, sperm isn't injected into the uterus. Okay. In vitro fertilization always involves two-parent. You have to have an egg and a sperm. And it does not use stem cells. Okay, pause here and give yourself a chance to answer these. Here's the mark scheme for part A. Here's the mark scheme for part B. And of course, don't forget to do that DBQ question at the end of your notes packet. And please go ahead and highlight any appropriate sections in your 6.6 learning goal.